our broadcast media action team support call for January. And the guest speaker that we have with us tonight is Adam Russell. Adam is the press secretary for Senator Dianne Feinstein of California. And previously, he was press secretary for Senator Feinstein. He helps her shape her messages on a variety of issues, including climate change and clean energy sources. And he's also responsible for developing traditional and new media strategies to promote her legislative priorities, since she is the top Democrat on the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water Development. And then before this, he's also served as the communications director for Congressman Sam Farr and as national staff member for the House Committee on the Judiciary. So we're very lucky to have Adam here with us tonight. Thank you very much for being here. We're really excited to hear all of your expertise that you can share with us.
Yeah, not a problem. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So tonight, after we've heard from Adam, hopefully you guys will have a better understanding of how to prepare for a live interview, how to develop key messages, and some tips about handling tough questions that you might encounter when talking about these topics in a live interview situation. So like I said, we'll do the interview and Q&A with Adam. We'll do a little partner practice in breakout rooms. And then before we sign off for the night, we'll come back together just to talk about what we practiced and answer any final questions. I'm going to toss it over to you now, just to kind of give us a little introduction about how congressional offices work with the media and how often this sort of live interview situation is a part of your job. Okay,
yeah. So I'll be kind of the congressional geek for a moment and say that I'm a big believer in the First Amendment. Free press is necessary for a functioning democracy. They speak truth to power. They provide a check to the government. And they also help us get our information out. So I always kind of say the press and a congressional office, it's kind of a symbiotic relationship. We need them, they need us. And so what we do is we try to get as much information to them that we want to get out there, anything that the senator is working on, anything that if we want to push back on issues that are out there or ideas that are out there, that's kind of what we do. And in exchange, they will often come to us looking for information. So it's kind of a lot of that give and take. And because of that, live interviews obviously play a big role. Here in Congress, most of the public spaces are open to the press. So anytime we are walking around with the member or heading to votes or anything, they can be stopped and asked questions. And then obviously we set up a lot of scheduled live interviews, whether that's they're going to go speak to like a cable program. We do that often here in the Capitol. Sometimes they'll actually go to the studios. So there is definitely a lot of work going back and forth, dealing with the press, and in that a lot of live interviews take place.
Awesome. So how do you go about preparing your member of Congress, or just in general? What do staffers like you do to prepare for live interviews?
Sure. So every member is a little bit different. Some members I've worked for want large volumes of information. They want to see every piece of paper they can on an issue. They want to read and absorb it all. Other members, not as much. Maybe they just want some quick talking points. They want to get a pretty firm understanding of the issue, but they don't necessarily need to read and experience everything. And then there's obviously anything in between. But in general, what I typically do is first we kind of research the issue, see what's out there, what are other outlets saying, what are other congressional offices saying, and we do that to kind of get an idea of just what is the debate, what's the crux of it. Then the next thing is I'll sit down with the legislative staff and we'll kind of go over it, make sure that I have a firm understanding of it. And then from there, we kind of start preparing the materials for our boss. That can be, again, very extensive. Sometimes we might be writing a large set of talking points. We might be providing numerous background info. Other times it might be very quick, just here's a quick one-pager on it. So it's kind of a lot of trying to determine how much information is the right amount, how much is enough that they'll be able to understand the issue without being overwhelmed, while simultaneously not giving them so little that they don't understand the issue. And so that's kind of the first part of my job. And then the second part of my job is we serve as a liaison with the press. And so, when we're setting up one of these interviews, we kind of set the parameters of what the interview will talk about, what will be the topics, what kind of questions are going to be asked, get an idea of how big of an outlet this is, what's their audience, the people who watch it, what do they want to hear and see. And then finally, we actually sit down and put together the talking points, and we give those to the member, and that's kind of the last stage until we get to the actual interview itself.
Awesome. So it sounds like a really key portion of it then is that the talking point element of making sure that you've boiled down what you need to get across in the interview. So how do you make sure that you have an effective talking point? How do you go about developing those?
The first thing you need to do, and if you take nothing away from tonight, if you just walk away with this one bit of information, is know your audience. Who are the people that are going to be hearing or listening to the information that you're putting out there? And I don't mean the actual reporter, but the actual audience, the people that are going to be sitting at home and gathering this information. What are they interested in? And then you also want to know what's their background in this issue. How much knowledge do they have about it? If you use really specific jargon, are they going to understand that? Or is it something that, you need to talk to them at a very, very basic level? And then the final thing you want to do is when you understand them, you want to think of ways that you can actually connect this issue with them. Case in point, when you all are talking about climate change, if you're talking to an audience that lives primarily in a coastal community, an issue like talking about sea level rise or the effects it's had on hurricanes, that might resonate more with them. Whereas if you're talking to someone in middle America, maybe it's an ag community, that's not necessarily going to resonate with them. But maybe if you talked about changes in growing seasons or how climate change has affected drought, that might actually work with them. So you really want to know your audience so that you know the information you're giving to them is something they can understand and they can connect with. One of the things we often talk about is you want to connect with someone's heart and their mind. And if you can do those two things, then you'll have an effective talking point. Now, getting to actually sitting down and writing those talking points once you have that audience, in general, most audiences, you want to kind of treat it like you're talking to people at a 5th grade level. That can change, obviously, if you're talking to maybe like academia or people that have extensive background on the issue. But in general, if it's just a broad audience, kind of treat it like a 5th grade level. Very simple, easy to understand words. Explain any sort of jargon. Don't just assume they understand it. As far as actually writing the talking points, the first thing is length. You want to keep it short and sweet. We jokingly refer to, sometimes we get talking paragraphs from the legislative staff. And that's just too much information for you to sit there to absorb, and also for you to then turn around and use when you're talking with the media. I kind of like to remind people we live in a Twitter world now. And so, short and succinct, it's going to do a lot better than if you have these long explanations. Having said that, you also don't want to bury the lead. Think about what's the main argument you want to make and try to make it at the very beginning. Don't spend a lot of time getting there, because you never know. The interview might get caught short. The audience may lose interest. You want to get your information out there as fast as possible. When I was in journalism school, they called it the reverse pyramid. You would talk at a very general level and then boil it down to concise points. And I think that works very well. Get the idea out there right away and then start breaking it down and discussing it more. The other thing is you want to make sure you're being upfront and honest with your audience. Sometimes people say in this job that we do spin, and I hate that term because I don't think that is what we need to be doing. I think what you should be doing whenever you're talking to the media is focusing on what you think is important, but doing so in a way that's very honest, that you're not completely negating any outside views or opposite opinions. And I think that's important. And then kind of this is the most important one, it's just write like a human. You know, think about the way you would just sit around and talk about this issue with your friends. I think sometimes we have this tendency, we want to come across as necessarily the smartest person or the most educated person or has the most knowledge on this subject. But in doing so, you kind of turn off your audience. Instead, just, you know, treat it like you would any other conversation, use very plain language. And I think those, if you've kind of followed those steps, that really helps write an effective talking point.
That's fantastic. Thank you. That's a lot of great information. And it started just a little bit to touch on our next question, which is, what do you recommend avoiding in a live interview? So if I heard you right, we should avoid sounding like a robot, right? That was one thing.
That's always a good thing.
Anything else?
I always suggest stay positive. Even if you're getting some pushback from the person you're being interviewed with, or maybe there's another person there that has a differing view, try to stay focused on being positive to get your information out there, not necessarily worry about anything they may be saying to kind of get you off your message. We've all seen it when someone gets frustrated in the middle of an interview. It just turns the audience off. They're no longer interested in what that person has to say. So first and foremost, just always stay positive.
Got it.
Humor is okay. You know, again, I say be a human, we joke, that's fine, but kind of avoid any snark or sarcasm. I think that can particularly turn off an audience. Again, that goes back to, you know, you really do want to keep it positive. And so, you know, some light humor is fine, but if you get too snarky or sarcastic, one, that might turn the audience off, or they may not pick up on it. And that can also negate your message. And then finally, and I think this is most important, or this is probably most obvious, is kind of keep it PG. Remember that you're speaking to a broad audience, and that you want to keep your language clean, and that is just obviously as important, because again, you don't want to turn off your audience, and that can have that effect.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so how do you recommend handling tough questions in an interview?
The first thing you need to do is you need to anticipate them. You're going to get asked tough questions. It's the job of reporters to tell both sides of a story. And so often that means they're going to ask you the opposite view of what you may believe. So you need to be prepared for that. You need to have an answer that, you know, acknowledges the question, but doesn't take away from your points that you want to get across. Again, you need to be upfront and honest. Don't try to gloss over or completely negate anything in a way that's not honest. You want to instead kind of take the information that they give you, and then turn it back around so that you're focusing again on your strong points. It's your job to be there is to tell your story and to get out the issues you want to get out. It's not necessarily to sit there and explain the opposing view. So if you get a tough question, talk about it briefly, but then turn the focus back into the issues you want to get out there, the points you want to make. In this business, they sometimes call that the pivot. Again, that's not necessarily a phrase I like. I think it kind of gets back to this idea of spin. And instead, I think it's just, you know, you're not there to do that. You're there to make your points. And so the time you have should be focused on that.
Got it. That makes sense. So what is the most important thing to keep in mind, just sort of zooming all the way out? What's the most important thing for our volunteers or for someone in a live interview situation to keep in mind when they're being interviewed?
The first is just relax, breathe, take it easy. It's just a conversation. I think sometimes when you start thinking, oh, I'm going to be on television or this is being recorded, that has a tendency to make people kind of seize up and not be their natural selves. And you really do want to avoid that. Just, treat it again as if you're having a conversation with a friend. Talk directly to the reporter. They'll kind of help you through and help you kind of understand, help you kind of get through those initial nerves. What I always tell people is reporters are just normal people. They're there to tell a story. It's not necessarily about gotcha journalism or anything like that. And so they want to hear your story. They want to hear your side of the argument. They want to hear the points you have to make. Otherwise, they wouldn't be interviewing you. And so, work with them. If you have some questions beforehand, ask them. And, where should I be looking? Where should I be talking? All those kind of things. They'll kind of help work you through that. And then that way, when you're actually on camera or if you're on, the radio or doing a phone interview, it'll come across much better. And again, just treat it like you would a one-on-one conversation. Focus on talking with the interviewer, making it a kind of a give and take, and not necessarily think about who else could be watching it at that very moment in time. Just treat it like a simple conversation.
Awesome. Great advice. Okay, so that is the last of the sort of formal questions that I had for you. But we've got some that our fellow broadcast media folks have put in the chat here.
Okay.
So I'll just start reading them off. So I got one from Alex that is asking, do members of Congress get a sort of playbook from either staffers or people who are donating money? Because so often she says, we hear the same words from our representatives, like the phrase, I'm not a scientist. And so she's wondering, where are they getting that? Are they getting some sort of briefing? Are they all working from the same playbook?
Yeah, sometimes it might seem like we're in an echo chamber here. We're kind of all repeating the same points. No, we don't get a playbook. We do work with outside groups. So, in the case of climate change, we work with organizations like yours. And so sometimes when you're in that collaborative environment, or if you're working with other offices, you will often come across a lot of the same talking points, or you just hear them and you start to pick them up. And that makes a good point, because what you really want to be doing is giving something that's interesting or new, or something that kind of helps tell your story in a different way that maybe it hasn't been told before. And so you do want to try to avoid sometimes those cliche phrases and stuff. Unfortunately, in this business, we do kind of fall back on them a little too often. But that is a great question.
Cool. Okay, so we need to think about very clear, concise, key messages, but also ones that can be original sometimes.
And I think one of the ways you make it original is think about your own personal experiences. Or again, go back to the audience. Think about the audience. What would make it personal to them? How is this going to resonate with them? How is it going to connect with their heart and mind? And if you can do that, then it will kind of naturally just become a unique and different soundbite, instead of just using the exact same talking point that maybe has been used a million times before.
Yeah, great point. Keeping the audience in mind. So we've got another question in here. Are you familiar with the TV show Designated Survivor?
No, I mean, I'm familiar with it. I've never watched it.
Oh, okay. The question is, how realistic is the give and take between the staff and the journalists in that show?
I wouldn't know from that show in particular. I think TV in general, from most of the shows I watch, it definitely puts a kind of a Hollywood spin on it that doesn't really exist. Most of the give and take between reporters and congressional offices is pretty dull and boring. It's a lot of emails and phone calls, and they're pretty just, they're looking for information. We have information to give them. It's a lot of back and forth that just doesn't quite rise to the level of excitement like what you see on TV. I'm assuming in this show, it's very combative. It's a very combative relationship. And I don't think that's necessarily the case in reality. Most of the time, like I said, this is a symbiotic relationship. We need them as much as they need us. And so we have to work with them on a professional level. And most of the reporters are the same. They come to us in a professional manner.
Awesome. One question here sort of ties into that. Somebody's asked, what are the rules as to what is considered on or off the record?
That's a great question, because I think so many people don't understand. And the first thing I'll tell you is there is no hard or fast rules. Everybody kind of has their own definition. We all kind of operate in the same realm, but it is important that you establish those parameters when you're talking with a reporter. Now, most of the interviews you all are going to be doing are on the record. Anything you say or use is something that, or say or do, can be used by the reporter. So just keep that in mind the whole time you're talking with them. Off the record is just that. It's completely off the record. It's not to appear anywhere in print or in the news later. I think what gets people some confusion is they see a lot of times, like they'll say this is from an anonymous source. That's not off the record. That's an on the record because the person did sit down with the reporter, told them, gave them quotes to use, or at least gave them information to use. Instead, what they did is they didn't actually attribute it to anyone particular. We sometimes call that on background, or background with not direct attribution. But in general, that's just something you want to determine with the reporter before you start talking. The other thing that's important is it's not like a get out of jail free card. You can't have a conversation with a reporter and then at the end of it go, oh, that was all off the record. It has to be agreed to at the beginning of the interview. The parameters, is this going to be on the record? Is this going to be off the record? Am I giving this to you just on background so that they can use it in their story but not necessarily directly quote me? Or is this just to kind of give them some awareness of what's going on? And so you want to establish that beforehand instead of saying something that you realize, oh, I shouldn't have said that, and then go, oh, but that was off the record.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And you're right that the interviews that our volunteers are going to find themselves in most often is going to be very straightforward on the record type situation.
And that's what I tell people. Just pretty much assume if you're talking to a reporter, it's on the record unless you all have determined something else. If not, everything you're saying could be recorded. It could be written down. It could be used. And just keep that in mind when you're setting up these interviews and when you're talking with them beforehand.
Awesome. So we've got a couple questions in the chat that are specific to CCL stuff. Wondering about how we might answer the question, what are some of the drawbacks of carbon fee and dividend, or could we emphasize the nonpartisan nature of our position? And those are things that you guys can practice in your breakouts and talk about amongst yourself, and we'll address that at the end. And then we've got another question here that says, any thoughts on social media opportunities like Facebook Live? Are you doing it, and how do you prepare the senator?
No, it's Facebook Live. Social media in general has been both great and difficult. One of the things when you're dealing with the press, they kind of serve as a gatekeeper, someone who not only helps get your information out there, but they kind of, since they're fact checking everything that you're saying, it often helps you verify or helps the reader verify whether this is trusted news or not. And social media, while it's great that you can get information out there as quickly as possible and as to many people as possible, it does obviously have some of its drawbacks, and we're seeing that now in the news. But in general, I'm a big fan of social media. I think it's a wonderful tool for getting your message out. It makes it very easy and accessible for people. And yes, you're right. Things like Facebook Live, just video in general, that all really does help get the information out there. And so what we use Facebook Live a lot for, and we do this in the caucus, we use it primarily for if we're doing any sort of big press conferences or anything like that. We do also do a large number of videos, and most congressional offices do that as well. stuff that they'll either post on their social media or maybe give it to a group to use for that.
Give it to a group, do you mean like record a message and then provide that to the press afterward, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. So like maybe an organization such as yourself is asking members of Congress their views on climate change. So we might record a message, give it to them, and they would distribute it on their social media.
Got it. So, okay. And here's a question from David. Specifically does want to know what you think about if it would be advantageous for our volunteers to emphasize our bipartisan approach when they're in a live interview situation.
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Yes. Definitely. Anytime politics is the ultimate team sport. You have to build coalitions. You have to work with people, not just within your own caucus, especially for us Democrats, because we're in the minority, both in the House and the Senate. But you typically have to get votes from both sides of the aisle. So anytime you can talk about the bipartisan nature of approach, that definitely works on both sides. It works. And also, it does resonate with the American people a lot better. Most people don't consider themselves a member of a political party, or maybe they loosely identify with one party over the other. But when they hear bipartisan, they realize that means this is kind of a middle-of-the-road approach, or an approach that can garner widespread support from both sides. So yes, definitely stress the bipartisan nature of your all's approach.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just second that just from the CCL perspective, that's something that's really unique about what CCL does is bringing together Republicans and Democrats on climate change. So anytime that you can emphasize the bipartisan element of our work or of the results we're seeing, like with the Climate Solutions Caucus in the House, that's a great thing to bring up. So any other questions? If you guys want to ask them yourselves, you can *6 to unmute, or click on your little microphone icon, or drop anything else in the chat. Let's see, I'm looking at all the little screens here to make sure nobody's waving their hand muted. Okay, oh yeah, we had a couple from Todd that I skipped. So how about rehearsing, Adam? Rehearsing your talking points or being in an interview situation?
Yes, that is definitely something you want to do, especially if you're not very comfortable talking in front of a camera. Anytime you can just sit there and work through your talking points, work through the way that you want to get your message out there, that's going to help you do a much better job. It's especially important if you're trying to get a very broad and complex issue out there, like climate change and your all's approach to it. The more time you have just boiling that down to very specific talking points and then delivering those, it definitely is going to improve your performance when you actually are in front of the camera. Practice makes perfect. So yes.
Awesome. And it sounds like that might be the answer to Todd's other question, which is just in general, any other preparation short of going to journalism school that our volunteers can do to be ready for these interview situations?
I think just kind of think about how do you consume information? How do you, when you're watching the news, what kind of speakers resonate with you, the things that they do? So kind of just, pay attention to what you think would work best, and then kind of carry that over into your own interview.
Great. We've got a couple more questions that all came in here at once. So Dorian is asking, what's the most exciting trend with regard to professional communication around science? And they say, for example, like new visual tools, networks, messengers, etc. Is there anything, I wonder, maybe, Dorian, do you want to unmute and explain a little more like what you mean? I'm not sure I totally understand.
I just was always interested when people work professionally. What's exciting to you, Adam? I mean, you spend day in, day out doing these things, you know, whether it's people are receiving messages differently, you know, they're accessing news and media differently, you know, you're building new, do you see kind of trends in coalitions like Citizens Climate Lobby where there's a direct interface with the public? I'm just kind of wondering from your standpoint, having done this so long, you know, what's exciting to you about the field, not necessarily obviously particular issues, but the professional field that you work in?
I think the changes we've seen in social media, and they're still ongoing. You know, when Twitter first started, it was just 20 characters, and it expanded to include, you know, first you could do images and then video, and now you can thread tweets and stuff. And it's constantly changing and evolving, and new platforms are coming on. You know, it's not just Facebook and Twitter anymore. There's Snapchat, there's Instagram, there's all these other ways to get your message out there. And so I think that's, you know, something I personally, I like trying the challenge of like finding new and creative ways to use them. Not just relying on the same, you know, write a tweet, send a tweet, but think of like creative ways to actually get information out there so that it kind of stands out. You know, for all you that use social media, you know, your news feed is just filled with all these different accounts that you're following, and how does one stand out over the other? And so that, to me, that's kind of one of the more exciting things, is trying to constantly reinvent what you're doing in a way that makes it both interesting for the end user, but also for you.
Great. So another question in the chat is, when you're told that climate change is a hoax, do you have a stock answer for that? Or do you prepare your members of Congress with a stock answer for that?
Yeah, I think, again, what you all are going to want to rely on is first your bipartisan approach. But when someone tells you something like that it's a hoax, don't necessarily spend too much time trying to explain all the reasons it's not. Simply dismiss that very quickly, point out, you know, the overwhelming evidence, or, you know, the percentage of scientists who all agree, something like that, to really just negate that incredibly false view, but then get back to the points that matter. And I think one of the reasons that some people think climate change is a hoax is because it is such this broad issue that affects people in very, very different ways. And we see the news like the ice cap that broke away from Antarctica, the one that was the size of Delaware, and that's very startling to hear and to think about. But it's really hard for someone to really understand. Most people have never seen an iceberg before. They've never seen a glacier, and so those things may not resonate with them. And so that makes it kind of easy for them to think, oh, well, this is a hoax, or, you know, it's cold today, therefore it must be a hoax. But if you start, when you're discussing it, thinking about your audience and finding ways to connect with them that they actually understand, you know, you're right, droughts have gotten worse where I live. Wildfires have become much stronger. I have noticed an increase in hurricanes, or, you know, the growing seasons around us have changed, or, you know, if you start actually connecting it in a way that the audience will understand, that's a great way to kind of push back against that idea that this is just a hoax, which is just, at this point, almost laughable that people still believe that.
Absolutely.
I've got one for you.
Okay, yeah, go for it, David.
Adam, the senator is really well known across the country for being sound and balanced, having a good sense of history, and for being polite and civil most of the time when others are to her. And we've harped a little bit about the bipartisan nature. There are now 66 members of the House, 33 Republicans, 33 Dems, who are on the Climate Solutions Caucus, and they're beginning to act on such things as the debate over use of the Outer Continental Shelf for drilling. And even Republicans, obviously, making some noise in that. I'm just wondering if the senator has any thoughts or approaches, or if you think that any of your colleagues from other offices could have an approach that would bring senators together in a similar fashion to the House Climate Solutions Caucus?
Well, I'm not here to talk too much about our own personal office and the way we operate. I want to ask a quick question though. The Climate Change Caucus in the House, it was 33-33. Is it one of the type of caucuses where in order for a member to join, they actually have to reach out and go find another member?
Absolutely, yes.
And I can jump in here, Adam, and speak to that. That the caucus, yes, it's something that is grows in a bipartisan way, but it's and we're always talking to every member of Congress, House and Senate, about ways that they can advance this conversation. But like Adam said, he's here to talk about media training tonight, and that's more of a strategic conversation that we can have at another time.
I will say that approach is one that is very effective, I think, because it requires a member to go out and find another member from the opposite party, and they kind of form a working relationship then around that issue. So you don't just have 33 members from both sides of the aisle, so 66 altogether. You really have 33 pairs, 2 individuals who want to work together and want to find a solution. And I think that does work well, whether we're talking about climate change or really just any other issue that has become kind of hyper-partisan or very controversial.
Absolutely. And we've got one other media question here in the chat asking, should we record the interview to check the reporter's quotes or respond to an unbalanced report?
That's a great idea. It's something we do all the time. Anytime I'm walking anywhere with my boss, I always do have a recorder on hand. In fact, right here. I also have an app on my phone in case for some reason I forget that. That is a great idea. And it is primarily just for accuracy. You want to make sure that you're being quoted in the right way, that they're using the quote not out of context, but using it in the way that you said it. And also, it just gives you a kind of a reminder of what you said, so that when you see your quote later in the paper or hear it on the news or something, and you're like, oh, I don't remember saying that. You can actually go back and see that, yes, I did. So yes, awesome. Definitely record them and let the reporter know that Alpan at the beginning. And I've never ran into a reporter that has an issue with that. Most likely they are recording it. And so, nobody has a problem with that. Don't feel you need to hide your recorder or something. You can just simply say, is it fine if I record this? They'll say yes.
Great. Okay. And we've got one question. I think let's make this the last question so we still have time to do our breakout activity. But Dorian's asked, what are the most challenging types of communication or interview situations based on your experience? Any particularly hard things?
I think what I find especially hard is when, all day long, members of Congress are bouncing from one issue to another. They're going from a meeting where they're talking about climate change into a meeting where they're talking about infrastructure. Then they're going to the floor to vote about this. And so they're often their head is in very, very different places. Whereas a reporter might have a specific question in mind that they want to ask that member, and they'll ask them the first chance they get. So oftentimes you'll see members walking in the hallways and they'll get stopped by a reporter, and the reporter will ask their question, and it may not just click, or it may not resonate. And so it is really hard for just kind of on the spot, what are your thoughts on this? Even if it's something they've been expecting, if it's something they have longstanding views on, or maybe we recently just put out a press release or something, or a statement, that may just not be where their head is at the time. And so that can be very difficult. I prefer, if we're going to do an interview, give us a chance to sit down and look at the information, prepare for it, not just because, that gives us a chance to get a good quote out there, or a good statement out there, but also it tells the story better. And so it's much better for the reporter. So I find that can be the most challenge, when it's just kind of that all of a sudden, what are your thoughts on this? And you haven't really had a chance to sit there and process it, or you're not in that mindset at the time.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, that's just about everything we've had in the chat. The only other things we've got are just lots of comments thanking the senator for her work, and also thanking you for your public service and for being here with us tonight. So we really appreciate all of this wonderful information, Adam, and your time.
Yeah, not a problem. Happy to help out whenever. And since you all gave me so many great kudos, I will pass them back. It's wonderful. I had an old boss who used to always say that, you know, politics is a participatory sport. So it's great to see so many people rising up and wanting to talk about issues as important as climate change. And that will have a big impact as we kind of try to tackle this issue.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Good Senator.
So we're going to head into our breakout activity now. So Adam, if you want to hang out and do a little media practice with us, you're welcome. Where to find the broadcast media resources on CCL Community, in case you want to watch any of the old calls that we've had, or if you want to join the team if you're not in it already. So if you go to CCL Community and click Connect up there in the top menu bar, and then Action Teams Directory, and then Broadcast Media is right there, the top one under Skill Building and Support. And if anybody's interested in helping lead this action team, we're looking for a volunteer leader. So just send me an email, join the group, and then let me know if you want to help us run this, find new people to be on calls and help us practice these skills. And so again, my name is Flannery Winchester. If you guys have any questions, you can always email me at flannery@citizensclimate.org. And then we'll put the recording of this call up on Community so that you guys can watch it again, reference anything that Adam talked about. And if you have any other questions for him, feel free to send them to me, and I'll pass them along and get an answer for you. So